What is going on, y'all? KMBest here. Let's take a look at the best decks to climb in Marvel Snap. One of the major trends in the metagame recently is that since it got a little bit more diverse, you can also have answers that are a little bit more diverse. Previously, the metagame was pretty stuck on Shadow King versus Cosmo Juggernaut, and that is still a thing that you're going to see a lot of, but since it's been a few weeks since Human Torch First Steps released, there just are naturally less Silver Surfers on the ladder, just by virtue of people that were playing it for Human Torch, going and experimenting with other decks, which has allowed decks like this to sort of shine, decks that are just generic piles of good cards that are in most games with a diverse suite of answers. This one comes from Andre Var. It's a very, very reasonable deck of the exact type that many of my viewers should be familiar with. Just a good suite of power and answers. The ability to have specially Cannonball as an answer is what really sets these kind of decks apart from previous iterations of mid-range pile, because Cannonball being an answer and being able to double up on the power of it with Fenris Wolf thanks to Mercury means that you just have a lot of random outs to random situations that otherwise you simply would not, and no other deck really gets that kind of, oops, I just accidentally the entire game. And that is really, I think, what sets these kind of decks, the ones with Cannonball Mercury, apart from the other good stuff piles. It's kind of just an alternate build of this. It's really just more dependent on what you value. Like, the Wiccan stuff is obviously great when you draw your cards in the right order, but you do have to actually run a card like Quicksilver in order to make it make sense. And because you are a Wiccan deck, it can be a little awkward to fit in cards like Mr. Fantastic. So it's really just a question of which of these cards or which of these extra energy plans you prefer. The rest of this is very much kind of the same. Like, you notice the same sort of Fenris Wolf Cannonball Mercury package. It's all exactly the same. It's just a difference in the accelerants that these two decks have chosen. Silver Surfer is honestly, I think, kind of getting a little underrated. I think this deck is extremely powerful, and while it does have some notable issues that can happen with its draws, it can be a little bit anemic, and there are situations where you need specific answers that you do not have access to. I generally feel like Silver Surfer is in a pretty damn good spot, in large part due to the Cosmo Juggernaut inclusion here. Now, you'll notice that I am running Human Torch First Steps. I consider it basically a flex slot between Human Torch First Steps and Sebastian Shaw. One of them is better earlier, one of them is better sitting in your hand and trying to soak up Gwenpool buffs. You can also argue over whether or not there should be a Galacta in here versus something like Absorbing Man. I have typically enjoyed the Galacta, but I do think it is sort of a live conversation that you can have. Generally speaking, there aren't a million flex slots in this deck because there are only so many of these cards that actually make a ton of sense. But I think there is something to be said for just having consistent points that do consistent things and being in almost every game you play because you are an excellent combination of points and tech. Now, customizing it further, that is something you can do, but baseline, I do think that this is pretty much the Surfer deck people should be playing. Let's move into the other sort of mid-rangey pile archetype here, and it's not V-Hand, even though this is a V-Hand deck. What I'm talking about is Shadow King stuff. There's a bunch of decks right now that are pretty reasonably playable, and they're all built around like these sort of similar things. There's a bunch of different like things you could do with Hood and Misery and Shadow King. That is absolutely a sort of nexus of this metagame. There's a bunch of stuff you can do with those cards plus a Juggernaut, or those cards plus a different game plan. And so I think of this as sort of that nexus of the metagame where it's like, Hood, Misery, all that kind of stuff. When you're doing Hood stuff with Shadow King, that's pretty much not necessarily one archetype, but one like macro archetype if you're looking down on the game from a bird's eye view, which is what I try to do in these videos. V-Hand is, I think, the most well-known and most proven of these kind of decks. There are plenty of other things you can be doing. I will also note that one major overlap that I've been seeing is that like decks that are doing this are also playing Werewolf and Merlin, and we'll talk about one of those in just a second, but there are just kind of a lot of things to do if you're a good player playing one of those decks that'll just let you win games where you otherwise probably shouldn't because of just how much control you have over the final turn of the game. With decks like this, you end up having a ton of really redistributable points, which only gets more pronounced if you do something like take out the V-Hand stuff and become a different deck with a Merlin Werewolf package. Like this, right? Like, I had an amazing run playing Darkhawk decks in large part because this isn't really a Darkhawk deck. Like, don't get me wrong, we're playing the card Darkhawk, and it wins us games sometimes. But what this deck really is Hood, Misery, Juggernaut, Shadow King, Werewolf by Night, Merlin. That's what's actually going on here. And you can do this with like a bunch of stuff, right? You could play this exact same deck, but with like Ronin and things that put stuff in your opponent's hand. You could play this exact same deck, but with like Devil Dinosaur and things that put stuff in your hand. It would be exactly the same. I prefer Darkhawk because there are a lot of engine-y decks, and I just want to brick my opponent's draws if that's at all possible. Also because I like cope staying, and Darkhawk is a deck that kind of encourages cope staying, which is great for me because I love to do that. But generally speaking, it's those 6 cards that are sort of the core of this macro archetype. They're just going to be in a bunch of different stuff. You're going to see a lot of things doing things with those specific cards. Hey, look, it's yet another shell that you can play your Merlin and your Hood and your Misery and your Juggernaut and your Shadow King and your Werewolf by Night in. Except this one is Sauron. Woo! Deck building in 2025! Yeah, you get what I'm saying here, right? Like, you can legitimately put those 6 cards with, like, most coherent game plans, and it'll probably work. Like, that is just where we're at right now in terms of those cards are like, to touch on like a football analogy here, they're like the Cam Newton to the 2015 Panthers, where it's just like, they're gonna drag everyone else along with them. It doesn't matter too much. Like, yeah, there's like a floor that you gotta hit to make those decks work, but you could very plausibly like play like Mad Thinker in these decks. And for the record, I have done this and I have won games, and Mad Thinker's really bad and you can still win games. Sera's a bit of a weird deck to play because it's so good if you're not getting Cosmo Eliath, because you are just going to be in basically any game. But it's so bad if you are, and there's just enough of them that you sort of feel a little bit weird about queuing a deck like this up. But it is just absolutely a great deck in a world where people are not playing like specifically Cosmo Juggernaut Eliath. And there is less of that than there was last week, which makes Sera a significantly more playable deck. This deck sort of lives and dies by how much of those 3 cards are in the metagame and how much Mobius is in the metagame. And it is just a very, very, very potent deck at beating anything that isn't doing those 3 things. It forces everyone to color within the lines, so to speak. I think there are multiple plausible move decks. There is this deck and, of course, Move Bounce, but Move Bounce is in a weird spot. I know a few people have been putting, like, Juggernaut in Move Bounce, which I think is, like, a very sweet thing to do, but also one of the most deeply evil things I've ever heard of in my entire life. I think that kind of stuff is actually like kind of important because of the ability of some of these decks to like do Invisible Woman stuff to you. I know Move Bounce is a deck people can succeed with, but it's extremely highly skill intensive, Whereas I think this deck is skill intensive, but it has just a little bit more training wheels on, and that makes it a much easier deck to recommend to people. This is a very functional deck that does very reasonable things, and I think it just has what it takes to be a consistent competitor in this metagame. If anything is hurting it, it is the prevalence of Shadow King, but you get to be a Cosmo deck, so it is honestly pretty okay if you are going to be vulnerable to Shadow King. It's just, this is a very hard deck to plan out final turns on, because you really do have to have an understanding of what you're doing and then also what they're doing if you want to try to beat it. I think Cerebro decks are weirdly underrated right now in that, like, I think they were a large reason why the prior metagame was the way that it was. And I get that they are not the greatest decks of all time, but I do think that they're pretty solid, and they have a very polarized matchup that means that you are just going to beat a lot of decks, and you know that that's going to happen very early. You have like a Mr. Negative level of unbeatability a lot of the time when you play a deck like this. And I think that it requires a sort of Mr. Negative level of snapping too. And largely, if the deck doesn't succeed, I think it's the players letting the deck down rather than the deck letting the players down. Like, this is a deck that legitimately has a lot of matchups that it is very difficult to lose. There are a lot of decks that just cannot deal with a Cosmo and then a Cerebro behind it. Just cannot even come close. The Supergiant Shell is actually, I think, pretty underrated as well. I played not just the Ronin version, but also a Devil Dinosaur version, where it's pretty much you would expect the exact swaps that actually happened, right? Like, oh, you take out the cards that do the Ronin stuff and you put in the cards that do the Dino stuff. Yeah, you get it, right? But basically, this is a deck that will never have too many points. And there are problems with being a deck that doesn't have too many points. But if you are able to get priority, play your Supergiant, and just absolutely obliterate everything your opponent is playing for the entire rest of the game, I mean, some of the time you don't even need priority. Like, that is how strong Daredevil Supergiant with a deck like this can be. It's just gross. And having the ability to have the single best Negasonic in Marvel Snap is really legit. Negasonic, by the way, is like, I won't say she's a problem card, but she'll win games in ways that I think people really only associate with cards like Juggernaut. And she's less all in terms of, like, she is less all-encompassing. But, like, there are games where it's just like, you literally cannot win because I'm going to put a Negasonic in this lane. The game is over. And she's just very, very powerful at base. And I think that she's kind of sneakily creeping up into being a potential balance issue. One thing that there has not been a lot of is Mobius M. Mobius. And this is, in my opinion, largely because he's not a productive answer to the 2-drops. You're playing a 3/3 and it's really only there to deal with stuff like this, or stuff like Sera, or stuff like Mr. Negative. And it still will absolutely deal with those things. But nobody really feels like they want to be doing that right now. And that means that a deck like Moon Girl Combo can really, really shine. This is a deck that has a ton of ability to output points late. It seeks to sort of be the smallest but most consistent of the combo decks, although I do worry that it might be a little bit too small. Like, the nut draw is obviously amazing, but your consistent draw is not always good enough to beat some of these decks on points. And I think if you're going to be playing a deck like this, you really want to have that locked in. When people talk about combo decks in this game, it's largely in the context of, like, big explosions of power on the final turn of the game. And this deck will always do that, but it might not have enough power to win some of the time. And that's unfortunate. It really is, because I think that this deck is good and fun and awesome and cool, but it's just a little too vulnerable to Mobius for me to want to risk the rest of the matchup profile. But this is an eminently playable deck, and as far as I'm concerned, is actually probably one of the cheaper decks in the game, although it has gotten more expensive with the addition of course, Mr. Fantastic. Maybe it's not cheap at all, now that I think about it, but I kind of always thought of Moongirl as a budget deck, but I guess for like a Mr. Fantastic deck, Fastos is in here, nobody owns him, so maybe we're not really a budget deck anymore. Point is, if you don't see a Mobius, you're probably going to be in the game, unless you're up against a combo deck that goes even taller than you. And those do exist. I think both versions of discard are very potent right now and are very easily able to be part of any metagame here. And by that, I mean this one and of course Khonshu, but I guess Hela as well. Like, there's just enough diversity that having a lot of ways to demand specific answers while there are not too many of those specific answers is quite powerful. Your nut draw, still insane. When you have a bullseye and a Dakin in hand, you're doing ridiculous stuff. It's very hard to predict a final turn from discard because you know there's going to be a lot of numbers, but you don't know where they're going to be, and you don't know what the interaction is going to be that you can have available to you. And that means that, for me, at least, there's a lot of Copes days when this deck is involved. And that is, I think, actually a pretty reasonable part of this deck's power, is that there's just a lot of games where it's like, oh, you know, if X, then Y, I can play to win this game. And realistically, that doesn't actually happen most of the time, and discard just sort of collects the wins. I think people have to respect this deck, I really do. Now that Kid Omega is sort of publicly available, there's been some maneuvering to figure out what the best way to play it is. And this is a riff on a Jet deck, I believe. It probably just is a Jet deck, every Phoenix Force deck is. But the idea here is you're looking to just do something stupid between Phoenix Force or Elixir. You're gonna effectively double up on your on reveals, right? Because you have those, even without a fire hair, you get an on reveal and then you get an on reveal again when you revive the card. So like a Black Panther, for example. This deck is just full of tricks, and I think fundamentally what happens when people play this deck is they don't know what's going on, but this deck can do more points than a ton of things in this metagame. There is a lot of power in a deck like this. Even just the baseline, like Cassandra Nova, blow up the Cassandra Nova, revive the Cassandra Nova on a Phoenix Force is like an 18 or a 16 power Phoenix Force. It's just kind of a lot, and that's just like your turn 4. Then you also have like all these Zola mix-ups. It's a deck that is very rarely out of the game. There's a lot of 50-50s on the final turn, but you are very rarely legitimately out of it. There's all this ridiculous like Black Panther revive stuff. Kid Omega gains a bunch of power. Now, downside, really vulnerable to Shadow King. And Shadow King is the #1 tech card in the game right now. And this deck is basically guaranteed to lose a lane to him. So it does have some risks associated, but as long as you play with SK in mind and don't get too cocky with your green power, I think this deck is a legit choice. Of course, so is the normal version of Kid Omega, and it has many of the same like characteristics. What's weird to me about these two decks is do y'all know that meme of like Daniel and the cooler Daniel? The deck we just talked about, that's the cooler Daniel. This is Daniel. But I don't think there's a functional difference between them. They're both still Daniel, right? Like, they're doing very much the same thing, except the other deck is using a bunch of different interactions to achieve it, and this deck is playing Shuri and then Nimrod. And then if your opponent can't beat that, they instantly lose the game. And that's literally it. Like, there's other stuff in here, don't get me wrong, but it's nowhere near as complex as the previous deck, and it has a very similar power output and very similar weaknesses. I do think that this deck is a little more vulnerable to the sort of end-of-game tech, the Juggernaut, Cosmo type stuff, by a pretty significant margin, but some of the decks that play like Juggernaut, Cosmo type stuff, they don't even beat like a Kid Omega Nimrod on a Shuri where it's just like, oh, there's two 12 power guys, just two Hulks, like I kind of just lose to that some of the time. So there is something to be said for a deck like this, but there's like a decent amount of Juggernaut Shadow King decks, a decent amount of Juggernaut Cosmo decks that I think are largely punishing it for existing right now. The Fantasticar decks have proven to be not a flash in the pan, because they're competitive level decks, but they're definitely the kind of thing where it's like, next week when they get Invisible Woman, then they'll finally come together and be what they are and have enough power to be like actually maybe busted. That's the kind of stuff where it's like, okay, let's do some crazy stuff. Let's see what happens. Unfortunately, I do think you still probably have to be an Evo deck. I played some Doom 2099 versions and they're fine, right? Like the Doom 2099 versions are fine. But if you want to beat that deck, you can probably just play like Afflict with a US agent and you're gonna beat that deck, right? Like that's not a hard problem to solve for me because so many of those games involve just completely safe locations for me to play my stuff. And I think that that is obviously a powerful thing to do and obviously an easy thing to do. And I do think it's the kind of thing that because it's powerful and easy, will look a lot better in the stats than it otherwise would. But I'm not super convinced you can go away from Evo if you're really trying to optimize Fantasticar. Like, maybe the Doom 2099 decks are just their own thing, because Fantasticar cares so much about having enough targets to justify it, right? You need to have a bunch of things that say end of turn. And I've tried the Doom 2099 decks with the Marvel Boy package in there. It's like, they're fine. There's nothing wrong with them. But ultimately, having those one drops detracts from your board spam plan when you are Doom 2099ing, and it ends up being a deck that if you don't draw Doom 2099 is just flat worse than the Evo stuff. So that's why I think the Evo stuff might be the thing that really sticks around here. I'm not positive. There could be a good hybrid to be made, but I've really enjoyed the Evo package as the dominant Fantasticar thing. We'll see what happens, because eventually there might actually legitimately be a Fantastic Four deck, and it might be as easy as people make it sound in terms of deck building. I can't wait to see what Invisible Woman does, but right now, I think that this is the way to play Fantasticar. Also, I hope you notice we went straight from Kid Omega to Fantasticar. Y'all know the deal. I'm a Thanos 10s truther. When people are playing a lot of their own Cosmos and their own Shadow Kings, I just feel like it can be a really good spot to be in, to be like one of the decks that's just relying on big bodies instead of bodies that are full of green power. And that's really the impetus behind this list, where it's like, A, you're a Thanos deck, you're filling up lanes, Juggernaut's not very good against you. B, you have all these guys that are just enormous that do not get Shadow Kinged. And that's also really compelling. And like, yes, you have a Strange Supreme, you have a Surtur, they can get Shadow Kinged. I get it. But you also have your own Cosmo to make sure that stuff doesn't actually happen. And I think largely what I enjoy about this deck is specifically its metagame relationship with Shadow King, where like if Shadow King were something other than a dominant thing, if Juggernaut as well were something other than a dominant thing, but like you saw how we opened the video, we're talking about the Juggernaut Shadow King package decks a lot of the time. There's a lot of those, and this deck just naturally is pretty decent into them on the fundamentals. 100% of people stopped playing this deck, and I don't understand why. I think it's actually still pretty good. If you want to just scam people out of their entire lives, you don't have to do that in Grand Arena. You can do that right here, right now in Marvel Snap with only 6 energy on the final turn of the game, and you can just blow people the hell out. Storm is just an excellent card right now, generally speaking. There are a lot of decks that are relying on setup. You have some awkward matchups, but you're usually able to play through those a lot of the time. Just Storm War Machine is extremely dangerous and extremely powerful, and there's really not a lot of interaction with it. When you have a metagame that has such a presence of Juggernaut, it's nice to be able to know that, like, okay, I got this Storm stuff going on, I'm gonna beat them off the board. One of the things that has really hurt this deck, though, is the prevalence of Doom 2099 versions of the... And for the record, I kind of expect this deck to literally die when Invisible Woman comes out. But before then, get your last few games in. Because, like, anyone playing Doom 2099 now, that's a bit of a niche pick, but you can do it. I've tried it. It's solid. In about 3 days, it's going to be really hard to play this deck. What it do, baby? You know what time it is. It is time to talk about Destroy, which is actually a perfectly fine deck. Like, yes, there's Juggernaut and Cosmo running around, but a decent amount of those decks aren't really going to have the priority to get them down when you actually would be wanting to get them down to disrupt it. You have Mr. Fantastic in here because you care deeply about 6+1, and you care deeply about making sure one of them costs 5 or 0 if you can, and that allows this deck to just straight up be legit. There is a flex spot here where I think it is entirely possible that Agony is the wrong choice, but I really enjoy trying to optimize for my Deadpool draws if I can get them. It's not a guarantee, but I feel like I play this deck a little bit more like a combo deck, right? And so when you're doing combo deck stuff, it's like, okay, aggressively snap and all that, and that's kind of how this deck has to be built right now, I think. But there are, of course, weaknesses, and you do have to care a lot about priority on turn 6. There are less people playing Sera, but that's a deck that'll blow you out a lot of the time. If people are just playing normal Shadow King tech stuff, you can throw priority into your full, like, Deadpool null combo if you want. And it's important to make sure that that is going to be lane winning, even against some of these decks that do a lot of points. All right, y'all. Thanks so much for watching. As always, I've been KMBest. You've been phenomenal. Remember to like and subscribe. And, I did that in the wrong order, right? Like, I should have said, I'm KMBest. You've been phenomenal, and nothing can change that. But instead I said, remember to like and subscribe, and then started to say, and nothing can change that. I really hope it can't. I'll see you in the next one.